All right, this is the second lecture in a series of lessons on exchange theory, theory by Peter Blau. And today we're just going to have a very narrow focus. We're only going to focus on the oil industry and factors that affect price. All right, right here, oil price right there. Okay. All right. So let's go back to a quick review of exchange theory. Exchange theory is founded in economic analysis. We focused on power in exchange. I gave you a couple of examples just to, whet your appetite of uh, pretty nefarious um, uses of power in exchange. Fairly recently, by a British private military security corporation called Aegis Corporation. A couple of governments they overthrow: Zimbabwe, Sierra Leone, in exchange for oil concessions or diamond mining concessions. All right, and let's see here. So yeah, the main focus is going to be on power in exchange, and that's going to relate to the oil industry and U.S. actions in the Middle East. Um, So we said that if you're in a situation where you lack power in exchange, well, how can you turn the tables? All right. I went through five examples of how to do that. We focused quite a bit on the last one, which is create a demand in the other person for a commodity that you possess. All right. And I gave a bunch of examples. One is with marriage, relationship, but I gave a number of examples involving drugs, uh, more nefarious examples, historical examples here. All right. And then I introduced oil industry because exchange theory is being used here as well. All right. And in this, as a quick introduction, I went over a statement by a former director of the CIA, James Woolsey here, and how he says that we have to destroy oil's monopoly on transportation and OPEC's cartel on oil. Right? I said I fully agree with destroying oil's monopoly on transportation, and the best way is through electrification of transportation. It's going to start with ground transportation. Uh, Air transportation is a different thing due to differences in energy density between batteries and fossil fuels. All right. Now, key thing is, you know, destroying OPEC, right? Woolsey said you got to destroy them. All right. They threaten economic viability, national security, stability of many nations. All right. The big question is how do you go about destroying OPEC? If it's some immoral means or method, I'm totally against it. All right. So oil is important. I try to explain how oil is important, showing two avenues. One is through transportation, which is the foundation of commerce, which is the foundation of industrial economies. Um, Another is through the synthetic chemical industry, with which the vast majority of products are made. I went through just a sample of things to give you an idea. And basically, the idea is this: if it's not made from basic things like they did, going back centuries and thousands of years, right? Right? Made of metal, made of wood, glass, ceramic, animal products, plant products, all right? If it's not made of those things, it's made of oil. So the vast majority of products that we use are made of oil. Um, so you can say, as in the broad definitions of tracking the advancement of societies through our ability to control material, we went from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, and then we leaped to the oil and synthetic chemistry age. And this was the big game changer. This allowed a vast increase in our ability to control matter, right? Which is a big part of our society, right? The stuff that We use our tools, our whatever things that we use for recreation or work or whatever. All right, and let's see. So then we talked about, well, why is oil so important? Well, it's because it's based on carbon, right? Oil is a hydrocarbons, and the key element there is carbon. Carbon is the basis of organic chemistry. Organic chemistry is not like natural. Organic chemistry is chemistry of carbon, right? Carbon is the basis of life, and carbon is the basis of the synthetic chemical industry with which the vast majority of the products we use are made, right? And there's two reasons why. One is it has carbon has four valence electrons and needs four more. That's a maximum bond you're getting, four bonds for each carbon. But which is important. But what's even more important is electronegativity of 2.5, which is right down the middle. And the significance of that is whatever carbon bonds to whatever element, it's going to form a covalent bond, which means it's going to form molecules, as opposed to ionic bonds, which form salts or crystals, right? With simple crystal lattice structures, right? So you can form molecules that have complex structures that are permanent, non-dissociable in, let's say, water, right? Uh, and they have very complex functions. And I gave you some examples. Cell signaling molecules, all right? All these enzymes are complex proteins, crazy complex, and they have very specific functions, very specific exact shapes, without which they're not going to work. And if they don't work, you're not going to conduct metabolism. You're not going to have chemical reactions in your body. You're not going to live. All right. So the idea is carbon, is a basis of any sort of complex molecule, which gives, the optimistic view that, man, you know, you can make any molecule there is, and market it if it's functional, if it's functional in some way, right? And then you make a new product, right? Which means you make a new market, which means you help expand the economy. All right. And we talked about the importance of oil for our economy. All right. We went through historical examples of big shocks to oil and the economy. Right. There's bidirectional effects. We went through some of those. All right. But clearly, oil has a huge impact upon the world economy. So, and that's through price. So the key question is, well, what factors affect price? All right, so that's important, understanding that. And that's today's focus. What factors affect price? Um, I drew up this diagram, and I admit that I tweaked it over time, but the vast majority of this diagram, like 95%, I threw down in just about an hour, or maybe like less than an hour, right? So, I don't want to sound like I'm bragging, but it shows that I have an integrated, holistic understanding of oil price. Not that these are the only factors, right? But these are the major factors. All right, so oil price is affected, of course, by supply and demand. All right, as supply goes up, price goes down. As demand goes up, price goes up, right? So this is an inverse relationship. This is a direct relationship. Uh, all right, so first thing we're going to look at is national political considerations. All right, that can affect supply. All right, indirectly through other things, and some of those national political considerations are, well, what's the political stability within your country, right? That may affect decisions on how much oil you produce. If you're an oil producing nation, it can also affect decisions on whether or not you apply sanctions or embargoes to other nations. We'll talk about that next. And using oil to conduct economic warfare. Limiting import of oil if you believe it's a national security risk. And then taxation of oil consumption, right? I guess we'll talk about this now because this is kind of an outline thing, right? So one thing governments do is apply taxes on oil consumption. European countries do that, especially, right, to reduce demand, right? And the problem is that this can impose an increased input cost for many companies through transportation or through, uh, you know, uh, if they're involved in synthesis of products made from oil, right? It can be an additional input cost, making them less competitive, right? So I don't know if that's a good idea, right? European nations do that. Maybe they want to wean themselves off of dependency on oil, right? Maybe they have it's something to do with cash flows, right? Currency flows, drainage of currency, whatever the reasoning. Uh, Municipalities even do that. For example, I know Chicago does it. I lived in Chicago for a while. They got a pretty hefty tax on gasoline, like 20 30 cents a gallon almost, right? And that's to increase revenues, get more money for the city. All right. Okay, so now we'll elaborate here on national political considerations. One means of doing that is through sanctions against oil producing countries. Let's say you want to put pressure on them, a little leverage to get them to modify their behavior, rightly or wrongly. You impose export restrictions, or you impose restrictions on other nations purchasing that nation's oil, like Iran, right? Or in the case of Iraq, you have United Nations sanctions preventing oil exports out of Iraq for WMD, to get pressure for them to get rid of their WMD. Now, what do I say here? Recently, Trump has been putting pressure on Iran with sanctions. He gave some exemptions. China, India, Japan, South Korea, Italy, Greece, Turkey, and Taiwan, who are heavily dependent upon their economies on oil imports. All right. Or oil producing nations can use oil as a weapon and embargo oil from certain oil importing nations who are in need of oil imports, like the United States. After 1970, 71 or so, we became net importers of oil there. Uh, Okay, let's see here. See, yeah. Like it occurred during the 1973 oil crisis, after the with the Yom Kippur War, OPEC nations, Arab nations embargoed oil from the United States, and that led to a serious drop in oil, a decrease of 5 million barrels per day drop in U.S. oil. That's what I read. That seems hard to believe, but that's what I read in a scholarly report recently. Okay, so those are both of these are forms of economic warfare, all right? But that's not the only means of economic warfare. Another one is overproduction of oil to drive down price, all right? This is the age-old method of underpricing your competition to drive them out of the market so that you get monopoly control of the market. It's something that goes back to, I'm sure it goes back old times, but as far as oil, one of the first big oil giants was J.D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, right? And then that's how he became a monopoly, right? He would dominate a market, become a monopoly, jack up prices to get excess revenues, and then he would use those to subsidize underpricing in another market to drive out his competition. Then he captured that as a monopoly market, and he keep going to the next market, right? Gobbling them up. So drive marginally profitable competition out of the market, right? And the Saudis tried to do that to the frackers. Frackers started, supplying, significant amounts of oil beginning maybe in about 2010 or so, right? Getting significant like 2012, 13, right? And the Saudis pushed. They're the main proponents of this. their strategy through OPEC to overproduce, to drive down price below the marginal profitability of these frackers, to drive them out of business, right? And they started that towards the end of 2014, somewhere around November or so, right? And I remember, gas prices, swung low. I remember paying $1.35 at a BP. That was the lowest I got during that time, right? And it was at a time when gasoline just a couple of years ago, 2014, just a year ago, a year prior to that was close to $4 a gallon, right? So this is a classic method of conducting economic warfare. But another means of doing this is overproduce to undercut the revenues of an enemy nation. Let's say a nation that you're at war with, right? Or who's at war with your ally. An example is Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, UAE. They overproduced during the Iran-Iraq war to help support Iraq, who is a Sunni nation. These are all Sunni nations against their nemesis Iran, who is a Shia nation. All right. So the idea was they overproduce, they get the extra revenues from the overproduction, but what it causes price to fall. The supply goes up, prices fall, and that causes a decrease in revenues for Iran, their enemy. So that's a form of economic warfare, right? Each of these affect price, right? So sanctions affect price. You apply sanctions against Iran, that could affect the supply, right? I believe the Saudis picked up, other nations picked up what was lost, so it didn't really, hurt price that much. Plus, you had frackers. This had a big impact, though. This had a whopping impact, and it whacked the U.S. economy. The 1973 oil crisis. All right, EFG. Okay, so another factor that affects supply is the world known oil reserves. Right, how much oil is in the world that we know of, anyways. Right, it can be more than we know of, and that's not, in and of itself the main. You got to combine that with production capacity, right? A lot of nations are producing at max capacity, but there are some nations, especially some like nations like Saudi Arabia, that have whopping excess production capacity. Remember, we said that gives them the ability to control price, that spare production capacity. They are the monitors of spare production, right? So I add here Arctic oil because that is, geological studies indicate that Arctic oil can be significant, and this could add to the world-known oil reserves. Once there's enough global warming to melt the polar ice in the north, right? So it's not a seasonal problem, right? I'm not sure when that's going to happen, when it's possible, what technologies are required, but it's something in the future possible. All right, so another factor that affects production capacity is political structure and laws governing business, investment, and operation, market mechanisms, economy as a whole, right? So I use Venezuela as an example because they stand out as the largest oil reserves in the world. You think Saudi Arabia or Iran or some Middle East country has the largest oil reserves? No, it's Venezuela, right? Now, they don't have the best oil. They don't have sweet oil. They have sour oil, which means it has high sulfur content, that's another process of purification or extraction. You got to get that sulfur out, right? And it's a heavy oil, but that's all right because most U.S. Refineries are geared toward heavy oil as opposed to light oil, which is, frackers produce primarily light oil. Okay, so they got the largest oil reserves, but they're notoriously known for having broken production capacity. And as a nation as a whole, they're heavily dependent upon a single commodity export, oil exports, right? So they're very vulnerable to price fluctuations and their economy as a whole, which means income of people, right? And this is compounded by something called Dutch disease, which is really Dutch disease is a factor in underdevelopment of third world nations that are in a colonial relationship, right? And, like our South, the U.S. South prior to the Civil War, right? This is a factor in decreasing the industrial development. There's many factors, you know. A key one it was in currency that we talked about, but this is a currency effect also. Dutch disease, and it's called Dutch disease because it was first. I think the magazine The Economist first coined this term to explain to kind of characterize the effect of exporting a major primary product like oil or natural gas in the case of Netherlands. They discovered natural gas in the 1950s, and Europe was pretty much energy poor. They had coal, right? Natural gas was a big benefit for heating, for fuel, whatever. Uh, and so at first this was thought of like, oh, this is a bonanza, a big boom, right? But then overall it started hurting the economy. And what happened was there was a high demand for Dutch natural gas, so a lot of foreign currency flooded into the Netherlands. Exchange for guilder is a Dutch currency, right? And that created a high demand for the guilder, right? So the value of the guilder went up. You had a very strong guilder, but what that did was that raised price on all other Dutch products, right? So that outpriced, for example, any manufactured goods that were made within the Netherlands. So that killed those companies, right? And the net effect was it created more unemployment. It had a overall, in the larger picture, it had a negative effect upon the overall economy, right? And that is a classic example of what happens in a neo-colonial relationship or colonial relationship where you have an advanced primary or you have an advanced industrial nation, right, with a one-sided trade, purchasing, heavy purchases of primary products out of that third world nation. It locks them in under development. Okay, so another factor here is, countries like Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, right, are social welfare states. Right? The population is largely, subsists on payments from the government, right? And this can lead to national debt, right? There can be problems with poverty, underemployment with this, right? And that can result in political instability, and that could drive nations to start increasing production of oil. But that can then drive increased supply, drive down price. So it's going to be what I want to say offset benefit, right? At first, you benefit from increased production, but driving down price, that any gains are diminished by the drop in price, right? And I say a good example of this happening was post Gulf War One, right, where nations were scrambling. OPEC nations were scrambling to increase revenues. There's a lot of political instability. For example, um, North African, oil producing nations, they're producing at near maximum capacity, and they're heavily dependent upon oil, just like the case here, right? And their economies are being whacked by the fall in oil prices, and they keep, over producing to the maximum amount, right? And what this can do is this can threaten or can destroy cartels like OPEC, which is organization of oil producing countries, right? And they get together to control production levels, to control price, to increase their profits, right? OPEC is a pretty significant player because, as a whole, it controls about 40% of the world's oil supply, right? Which is whopping in one group. That's a whopping amount. They have a lot of power. Okay, yeah, GHI. Oh, okay, yeah. So talked about debt here, social welfare states. Now they can get big debt, right? As a social welfare state, as revenues fall, um, or through war. War is a big creator of debt, That is significant. This is the main focus on how war is used in an exchange to get power in exchange to control oil price, right? But also lavish spending by these nations has happened. For example, after the 70s, the Arab OPEC nations, right, were swimming in cash, so they developed lavish spending habits, right, and then prices fell in the early 80s, and economies were tanking. There's a recession, so there's decrease in oil demand, prices falling, so their revenues are falling, right? And they became major debtors, right? So with this in the early 80s, it became recognized and clear that just as Arab nations used oil as a weapon in the 70s, well, debt can be used as a weapon against them. Um, HIJ. Okay. All right. So this was, and those first, that was first, I guess, realized in practice in Iran-Iraq War. Um, so HIJ, national security. So another national political consideration, national security, right? Oil import quota. Eisenhower in '59 instituted a oil import quota. You limit the amount of oil that we import into the country because they believe that dependency upon foreign oil would be a national security issue. You know, I don't know. I have to analyze that. I kind of question that, but um, anyways, that was in place between '59 and '73 when Nixon canceled it because we're just desperate for oil, right? We're not making enough oil for ourselves, and we got to get oil, right? So you just said screw this restriction, and actually the embargo hit right after this. Uh, Oil import quota was lifted. All right, so what it does is it restricts oil imports, so it decreases supply in the domestic market, which raises price, but increases supply in the world market because we're not consuming it, right? So it has impact upon supply, impact upon price, but depends upon what market, right? U.S. versus world market would be the opposite. Um, HIJK. All right, so another government imposed restriction is 73 when this was lifted. There was also a restriction on oil export of crude oil, right? It didn't apply to products of oil, finished products of oil. But crude oil, those restrictions on exporting, and that was in place between 73 and 2015, very end. December, it was lifted. 2015, that affects supply in the world market, it affects price, right? So fracking, what was happening was fracking was starting to kick in. Like I said, first trickles were coming out like 2010 or so, but it quickly increased, rapidly. 2012, it's taken off, and that dramatically increased supply, which brought down price in the U.S. market, right? So by allowing exports, um, well, I mean, dropping price in the U.S. market is great for who? People who drive cars, right? But if you allow exports, well, that's going to temper that fall in price due to the increased supply of fracking, right? So that's the losers are with this lifting of restrictions. The losers are U.S. consumers of gasoline, right? Benefit is going to benefit the world market. The oil price is going to drop as more supply to the world market. Um, okay, and uh, what's interesting here is, this the impact of this with well, anyway, okay, HIJKL. All right, so L cartels, cartels like OPEC try to restrict production, restrict supply to increase price and their profits, profit margins, and so yeah, they can restrict supply to increase price. HIJKLM. Right, so this is something that Woolsey talked about, busting OPEC. How do you go about busting OPEC, right? Now, I mentioned already, if it was in the United States, uh, the Justice Department would have jurisdiction and they would break them up as a trust. But no, this is international. This is out of the jurisdiction of, a U.S. national organization, right? So you can't do this. You can't use laws to do this. Well, how are you going to do this then, right? How do you destroy OPEC? That's a key question, and I'll explain that. Uh, Key thing is it's done through conflict and war. All right, now I know people are going to immediately jump and say conspiracy theory, conspiracy theory. Oh, you don't do that. U.S. don't do that. U.S. is right. I mean, come on, right? Uh, all right. So I'll explain it. I'll show you how it's done. All right. And um, Global warming is another factor that can affect supply. All right, especially with the melting of the polar ice. The North Pole ice cap. All right, there's no continental south area. It's just ice, and that fluctuates in size, varying in summer versus winter. It grows during winter and it shrinks during summer. Plus, it's moving, so it's kind of tricky. Um, it's massive, moving sheets of ice, and nothing's going to stand in this way, right? It's going to tear through oil rig. So, um, you can't access the Arctic ice. There's believed to be a significant. I mean, I don't believe it's as large as Venezuela's oil reserves, but it's significant up there. And if you can access that, there will be a new known oil reserves that this can supply oil, increasing supply, bringing down price, right? Um, it may require new technology, right? And the big beneficiary of that would probably be Russia, because northern Russia, is right on the border of that all that Arctic Sea there, and it looks like that area right off the northern coast of Russia could be clearing with global warming. There's been a significant melting of that northern polar ice cap with global warming. It is substantial, right? Also, global warming can affect winter temperatures, which can reduce consumption of heating oil, possibly. This is probably a bigger factor. This Arctic oil, Arctic sea oil, is kicks in. And I said it may require new technologies. I don't know. Uh, okay, and LMNO. Another source of oil to add to supply is national reserves or private company reserves, right? But these would be short-term impact upon oil supply as reserves are drawn down or built up again, right? Uh, uh, if you build up these reserves, you're taking supply out of the market. As you draw them down, you're adding supply into the market. Okay, so draw down upon national strategic reserves. U.S. reserves that was instituted in '75. I should put there. In response to the oil embargo here, all right, he said, all right, we better have reserves. Remember Pearl Harbor? Japanese war plans and U.S. It was common knowledge, right? It was reported in New York Times, for example, right? 6 months Japan has, right? Oil reserves. So captured documents after the war show that Japan had their military assessments were they had 6 months oil reserves, right? We have 3 months, 90 days of oil, right? That's what we try to maintain in our national oil reserves. And there were three instances that I know of that presidents ordered the drawdown of national reserves. That was Clinton during the first Gulf War, Bush during Katrina, when all that Gulf of Mexico stuff was whacked, and refineries along the Gulf of Mexico coast there. Obama did it during all that. the Libyan revolution there, oil export out of Libya, uh, ceased rapidly, and so Obama ordered the drawdown of reserves there, right? Private companies have their own reserves, whether it's in tanks. A lot of it are in like old oil tankers, right? They maintain some reserves on hold there, trying to take advantage of market fluctuations. Um, okay, OP. Oh, inflation. Okay, so inflation can affect oil price directly. For example, during the inflation in the Nixon era in 1971, he ordered price controls. I'm not sure how good idea price controls are. I have to like really analyze that, but I tend to like rather have the market monitor price. But so government imposed price controls 71, right? That can affect oil price in the domestic market. Inflation can also affect dollar value, of course, right? Because that's what inflation is all about. Weakening dollar causes prices to go up, and so dollar value. And why that's significant is because the vast majority of world oil is traded in dollars. That's called the petrodollar. It was established by Nixon back in '73. Nixon got first Saudi Arabia, then all the rest of the OPEC countries to agree to sell oil in exchange only for dollars. And it was a couple means. It was a means of increasing demand for dollars to jack up dollar value to be a hedge against inflation. All right, that was the primary purpose of that. It was also intended to cause recycling of U.S. currency. Um, so the primary currency of oil trade is a dollar. If dollar value goes down, that means oil prices go up. So that's a direct impact upon oil price. Now, what other things affect dollar value? Well, we said inflation, but inflation can have another effect, not just directly, but also through interest rates. Remember, we said that if you have a high inflation rate, well, banks, in order to get capital to lend out, that's how they make their money, right? They have to offer interest rates higher than the inflation rate, right? So a high inflation rate will cause a high interest rate, an even higher interest rate. Now, if the U.S., for example, has a high interest rate, like during the late '70s, early '80s, right? You have, let's say, 12, 13% interest rates. Foreign countries, people in foreign countries are going to try to take advantage of that. So there'll be a flood of foreign currency into the United States, creating a high demand for dollars in exchange so that they can, invest in the U.S. and take advantage of the high interest rates. What that's going to do is that's going to create a high demand for dollars, and that's going to jack up dollar value. Now, with a strong dollar, right? So that'll affect oil price, right? But also that's going to affect the balance of trade because with a strong dollar, that's going to jack up U.S. The price of U.S. goods. So it's going to hurt U.S. exports, right? Which is going to have a bad effect upon the balance of trade, right? Okay. All right. Very similar to Dutch disease, right? In this case, it's not a commodity that you're exporting. You're basically exporting capital investments, right? Uh, you're selling investments. Okay. Either way, it's creating a demand for domestic currency. Okay, S. Where's S? Oh, the big factor in it all, right? In oil price is the global economy. I say this is the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room, right? The big factor in both oil price and demand, right? So as the economy goes up, oil demand goes up, which means oil price is going to go up. As the economy goes down, oil demand goes down. Less people buying things, people out of work, they don't have money to buy gas, they don't have money to buy products, so there's less shipping of goods, less transportation costs, less use of fuels, right? So this is the big driver here of oil price. I mean, all these factors are important, but this is certainly a big one, right? But this is filtered through the futures market. Very little oil is purchased through the spot market, right? So most of this goes through the futures market. and that goes in effect affects demand, right? Which affects price that way, all right. So we looked at supply first. Now we're going to focus on demand. We said that one factor is conservation technologies. If you have increased fuel conservation, am I doing this in the right order? ST, where's T? U, where's U? Oh, U here. Okay. So I'm doing U first before this. So U is oil price can affect investment. If, for example, oil price goes up, people are think, oh man, it's worthwhile to invest, right? You're going to get some payback in this, right? They're crunching the numbers and trying to figure out how profitable it's going to be, whether that they can make the numbers work, and they say, yeah, let's invest. We'll develop a new oil rig, right? We'll develop new technology or whatever to get more difficult to get at oil, right? So increasing oil prices will increase investments, maybe new rigs, right? Expanding the number of rigs, expanding to different areas. Um, a decrease in price could possibly increase the search for increased production process efficiencies, right? Maybe that's new technologies there. Develop new technologies for oil exploration and extraction. That's a possibility, right? Increased access to difficult to extract oil. Deep sea oil is one thing, right? I mean, you can get oil in the Gulf of Mexico if it's on the continental shelf. Continental shelf may go down 200 feet. You go deep sea, ocean levels plummet to thousands of feet, 3, 4, 5,000 feet deep. I mean, that takes some serious technology to get that oil, right? Continental shelf, for whatever ice age, it developed during whatever last ice age there was, right? And that's like 200 feet deep. That's workable, right? But deep sea is something entirely different. Um, Tight oil, which is the oil in shale rock. You get through hydraulic fracking, right? It takes a new technology. It takes horizontal drilling combined with pumping high pressure water to fracture that rock. Yeah, that's why they call it fracturing, because you're pumping it since high pressure water. It cracks a rock, releases the oil that's in layers between the shale rock, right? Um, Takes some more technology, a little bit more cost intensive than, for example, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's got very good oil. Just think of like early Texas oil, right? You hit a gusher, it's just bursting out under gas pressure, all right? Easy to get to. You don't have to pump it, right? It's coming out under its own pressure. A lot of wells are like that in Saudi Arabia. Well, fracking takes more, so that's why they have less marginal profit. They have a higher marginal price than, like, say, Saudi Arabia. So they're vulnerable to aggressive underpricing by OPEC countries, right? Arctic Arctic sea oil, could be kind of tricky. Canadian oil sands, I tend to think this is not a good idea because it takes so much consumption of hydrocarbons in the form of natural gas to heat up this oil to release it from the sands, right? That as far as balance sheets for the climate, this is not good, right? If they make it work financially, well, okay, all power to them, but I don't know. Um, okay, increased oil price encourages development of marginally profitable oil fields, right? So price can affect the amount of supply here. You see that, all right? All right, okay. And then another thing that affects demand is new technologies, all right? If oil prices, oh, you know what? I can draw a line here. And this is definitely true because, when the first big oil crisis hit in 73, uh, that was when there was a big shift in the U.S. automotive industry towards more fuel efficient cars, and it had a big impact on the shift to purchase Japanese cars. Japanese were making smaller, more fuel efficient cars, and so people are, that was a big factor in the rise of the Japanese auto imports into our country, right? Most cars were basically U.S. cars bought and sold back then. The big ones, Chrysler, GM, Ford, whatever, right? And the first shift towards uh, big shift towards Japanese cars occurred with that 73 oil crisis, right? So, but you can have not just more fuel efficiency, not just in cars, but also in homes, right? There was a big effort after 73 also to improve insulation, sealing homes. You know how they got that DuPont, or I don't know who makes it. The house wrap stuff, those big white sheets with all the stuff printed on this. I think it's like DuPont, right? uh, to seal homes, make it more airtight, less drafty. So you're conserving fuel, right? That's affecting demand, right? Decreasing demand. But there's limits to internal combustion engine efficiency, plus marketability. A lot of people want their big engines, right? They want their big SUVs. They want their cars that can accelerate fast. You know, they want that 500 horsepower, I don't know, sports car. Um, okay, so marketability is part of that, right? Man, if you want a fast accelerating cars, you know, good luck beating an electric car, right? Electric cars can have massive torque, right? Okay, you don't need this, gas guzzling engine. Okay, all right. So what am I doing here? UVW. Okay, W. We talked about winter. Yeah, winter temperatures, right? So winter temperatures fluctuate. I mean, this is a big part of the futures market. Guessing what the how the winter's going to be, right? Climate forecasts. All right. So this is going to affect heating oil price, right? Filtered through the futures market. uh, will affect heating oil demand. Um, all right, so these are things which are, I think, are the best means of decreasing demand. Coming up here, alternative fuels. Well, this is less so. You know, like renewable fuels, biodiesel, ethanol, natural gas. I'm not a big proponent of ethanol. I know farmers are going to hate me if I, saying this right. Um, because I don't think it's very efficient. It's, I believe it's actually more energy intensive to use ethanol. I mean, just think of all the fuel and hydrocarbons that are used in fertilizer, in harvesting, planting and harvesting that corn, right? And then the energy required to process, basically to the bio, or incubators, whatever, where they convert the hydrocarbons in corn to ethanol with bacteria, whatever. Um, and it's energy intensive. I think you're at an energy deficit probably using ethanol. Biodiesel, it's not so hard to extract the oils. This is like oils out of seeds, right? It's the same as what you use. It's like vegetable oil basically, right? Uh, Natural gas. Yeah, I know some municipality vehicles use natural gas, right? Burns a little cleaner. Um, all right, but what's bigger is alternative energies. Using electricity, right? Well, okay, wait a minute. Alternative energies will decrease oil demand, right, to some extent, but primarily through electric vehicles. This is gonna be huge, right? Not too many people use oil to produce electricity. Hawaii does because they're an island and they got to you're not going to import coal. They're going to import to produce electricity. They import oil, right? Uh, they don't have natural gas pipes long enough to go from the mainland to Hawaii, so it's going to be oil. Uh, but they're shifting over to alternative energies, quite a bit, which is good, right? Facilitated with storage. I believe there's some like what do you call it? Elon Musk stuff, battery, but using hydro storage, um, pumped hydro. Um, Electric vehicle technology is going to be is very is, the critical weak link there is battery technology, right? But there's been rapid development in this, plus there's huge additional growth potential, right? When you got technology growth potential, man, this is you can milk this, to boost our economy for a long time, right? New products, new generations of this and that, right? Uh, uh, Key factors here are range, charge time, battery cost, and battery life, right? Battery life is already beyond what you need, right? I mean, how long does a car last, right? 200, 300,000 miles, right? Battery life is exceeds that easily. And Elon Musk recently announced that he's got a million mile battery. Yeah, so what it's saying is uh, lifetime is no longer a limiting factor. The battery's going to last beyond the life of the car. Car's going to break down first. It's going to rust out, break down, whatever, right? And the thing about it is, electric vehicles are going to have less maintenance. There's less parts. They're less complicated. You don't have all the support systems. You don't have all the different, lubricating systems, oil pumps, and whatever. You don't have all the different cooling systems, and um, you don't have the separate, electric generating systems, alternator. You got it. You got that. You got the battery and you got motors, right? Uh, it's going to simplify cars. It's going to decrease maintenance costs. Right. This is the way to go. All right. Electric vehicles. All you got to do is get the range. And you know what? There's potential for the range to greatly exceed the range of a gasoline car. You're limited in range in gasoline cars. I mean, you're looking at what, 4, maybe 500 miles max, right? How many cars get 500 miles on a tank of gas, right? Uh, you know, Potentially, I mean, you're looking at top end range like 300, 350 now, right, with Tesla stuff, right? There's potential for a lot longer range, um, especially with new battery types. You know, okay. All right. So, but the benefit of this is, I say, new technologies always create new markets. New technologies create new products. Whenever you make a new product, you make a brand new market. That's economic growth. That's a little jump there in the economy. For each new product, you got a brand new market. You don't have to try to fight and struggle and go to war over controlling some market. Well, you just make a new market, right? And there's potential for unlimited growth. You know, just like I said, with the potential for unlimited number of products with hydrocarbon synthesis, right? We need to be using oil for that as opposed to burning. I mean, this is going to be using oil for transportation is going to be thought of as a stone age in the future, right? I can't believe we're burning this stuff back. You look back in the future like, what? We're burning oil? um, all right. So not only that is going to cause, so this is going to be a big boost to the economy. Remember how we said the economy is a big factor here, right? New technologies, new market, economic growth, but also be through decreased transportation costs. All right. Uh, right now, electricity per mile is somewhere between half the cost to 1/5 the cost. Top end is 1/5, right? You know, so instead of paying $1, whatever, you're paying 20 cents, right? Maybe it's not that optimistic, but even if it's like half, that's a killer savings. Now, that's going to be great for the average consumer. Well, who is that going to be great for? People who have tons of transportation costs, and that's people in business, right? This is going to be, and that's going to be a big boost for our economy. It's going to be a big hedge against inflation, right? It's going to be a big boost in cutting overall prices of products, right? So I mean, it's going to be good overall. Electrification is the way to go. Plus, it's going to drive demand for new infrastructure. Installing, and there's going to be potential for new technologies. I mean, they're talking about inductive parking spots where you don't have to plug in. You just drive over a spot, and then you have a chip that's red, right? And that is connected to your credit card, and you just press a switch, press a button, and you charge your car there at a parking spot, or they're talking about inductive pickup along the road, right? Roads that have that. I mean, if you have that, that's going to be massive infrastructure development. That's going to be a lot of jobs, right? Even just developing all the parking spots, right? All the recharging stations, right? That's going to be a lot of infrastructure, and there's going to be growth in technology. It's going to change. You're going to be replacing it, making it better, making it more efficient, right? Making charging faster, all sorts of stuff. There's potential for growth. You got potential for growth and changing to getting better gasoline pumps. I mean, come on, right? There's growth potential there, which means new markets. This is the way to go. This is going to be a big boost to our economy if we go in this direction. As this accelerates, it's going to help, right? And my big thing is get off of oil. Oil is a way of concentrating the flow of wealth, right? Concentrating the flow of resources, and I'm going to talk about hydrological engineering at the very end. It means of really controlling wealth and power, right? Well, one of the ways is through oil, and that I don't like it because a main, I'm going to say, ancillary effect is you get wars, right? You get conflict, you get all the killing and so forth. So I like to see oil go bye-bye as far as transportation, right? Take it out of their hands. All right, that's it for this lecture.